Hey, I'd just like to thank you guys for having me again here. It's always a pleasure to be at the Rockville American Legion Hall, post 86. Anyway, I'd also like to thank the co-authors of the magazine article that my co-authors and I did that appeared in this April 2018 Battlefield Photographer magazine, published by the Center for Civil War Photography. So that is Eric Michael Davis, who lives in Frederick, and Craig Heberton IV, who lives up in Connecticut. So very good researchers, both of them. And I just want to thank them for all the help that they provided in bringing the truth to this story. So the famous photo was first published simultaneously in the spring of 1965 by James V. Murfin. It first appeared in Civil War Times Illustrated magazine, April 1965, and Murfin's book entitled The Gleam of Bayonets, released in May of that year. Murfin obtained permission to publish the photo of the Confederates depicted on the street in Frederick, along with two photos depicting Union troops showing them on parade in Frederick. Murfin guessed the incorrect campaign when the Union forces were photographed. He also created fiction when he related that the Confederates were photographed sometime between September 6th through the 10th, 1862, because he somehow wanted the photo to work for his book, which was about the September 1862 Maryland campaign. At the time, in the early 1960s, he had no understanding of the photograph and its origins or history, only obtaining copy prints from Ben Rosenstock in year 1963. So William Frazanito published his second book entitled Antietam in year 1978. He said in the book, one of the most unusual Civil War photographs uncovered in recent years is a candid scene taken from the second-story window of a building on Market Street in Frederick by an unidentified but probably local cameraman. The view shows a column of armed Confederate infantrymen halted in front of Joseph Rosenstock's clothing store. Ever since its first widespread publication in the mid-1960s, this photograph has been presented as having been recorded sometime during the Confederate occupation of Frederick in September 1862. After examining the photograph and interviewing its owner, I can, however, regard only two items of information to be certain at this point: that the view was taken in Frederick and that the soldiers are Confederate. The Confederates passed through Frederick two times during the war, once in September 1862 and almost 2 years later in July 1864. With continued research, the authorship, date, and perhaps the unit identification may be one day determined of this photo of Confederates on an active campaign during the war. So this is a photo of Bill. This is his favorite photograph when he was in ROTC before he went to Southeast Asia in the Vietnam War with President Eisenhower there. So, John Michael Priest, an excellent researcher and historian who has talked here at the American Legion Post for the Norris Camp, in year 1992, had this awesome book published by Oxford University Press. He's talking about each individual day during the Maryland campaign of 1862. In chapter 6, which details September 10th, 1862 in detail, page 65, the course uncoiled very slowly. The Confederate officers, pursuant to orders, deliberately formed their men in columns of 4 to stretch out the regiments when marching through Frederick and convince any of the citizens in Frederick, federal spies, that the Army of Northern Virginia contained more men than it actually had, because as you know, through the summer of 1862 at the battles of Cedar Mountain and Second Manassas, a lot of casualties. Lee entered Maryland very short-handed. So you can see the photo here has approximately 6 men across in files. So that is one of the issues that I realized when researching this photo. So this is a detail. An 1887 Sanborn fire insurance map of Frederick. Eric Davis, my co-author, modified this to show you what the photo looked like, the camera angle, the properties that are in the photo. The savings institution is just to the left, out of range of the photo. William Tyler was a wealthy banker, business in Frederick at the time. His son lived next door, George Murdoch Tyler. He had two sons that were in Maryland U.S. infantry regiments. They were officers. I will show you them later. Anyway, this is just a detail of showing what the photo area looked like. Now, most historians, or all of the public before we did our investigation, believe that the photo was taken either here or this way, because they understood that Rosenstock had his store on the corner of East Patrick and North Market. Now, Rosenstock did not move to this location until the year 1868, after the war was over. Nobody knew that. So this is the cover of the magazine. This is a photo that Eric and I did. We had to do it in the wintertime because there's now big trees on North Market Street. We wanted a view where there's no green leaves blocking any of the buildings behind. We had to go there early on a Sunday morning in January, very cold. And we threw a long pole up against an apartment building. And we had to do this very early in the morning because we didn't want to look like peeping Toms, for one. We didn't want to involve the city of Frederick because they would have been like, hey, you want to do what? You know, it would have taken 6 months for them to approve. And by then it would have been summertime with green leaves all on the trees. So we went ahead and did this photo. Now, everything is basically accurate to the curb line. Eric did research where he pulled the files. North Market Street was probably within an inch distance of how it was during the Civil War with the curb lines. Nothing had changed in all of that time. We basically where the sign entered into the sidewalk. Our measurements were probably within an inch accuracy. So later on, John Kelly's Washington Answer Man, he covered the story in the June 6, 2018 issue of the Washington Post. John Kelly's a great drummer. He plays in some local bands. I think one of the band's names, Airport 77s. They do 70s and 80s rock. So in year 2021, Alex Rosino published a book called There, Maryland, about the 1862 Maryland campaign. He disparaged our discovery and investigation. Somehow he was obsessed with the 1862 campaign. He was in a shock when we presented the findings of the proper location, so he could not move the photo spot to the incorrect location. So what he did was he moved the troops to incorrect locations where they never were during the Civil War. And one of Alex Rosino's two claims in Chapter 5 of Their Maryland Rebels Photographed in Frederick, the case for September 1862, one of the guys that he used was a man named James L. Parsons, who was a property developer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He wrote many articles, letters to the editor in the Baltimore Sun newspaper, claiming that Confederate infantry passed below Byerly's studio on the morning of September 10th, 1862. And claiming that no significant, well, this is Rosino, he was claiming that there were troops in front of Byerly's studio on September 10th. Now that's a falsehood. So Parsons wrote in the 20th century, in our investigation, we found that James L. Parsons never served in General Lee or General Jackson's army. Parsons and his twin brother, David Wood Parsons, were born on March 19, 1847. Their father, Oswald Parsons, served in the 23rd Virginia Infantry Regiment. David W. Parsons, his twin brother, was drafted at age 17 in 1864. So Parsons created falsehoods and myths when he wrote letters to the Baltimore Sun. He most likely did this because he was a stooge for the Barbara Fritchie Society, who was a very powerful lobby. Now, many people have scrutinized the route of the Confederates leaving Frederick on September 10th, not because of that photo, but because of the Barbara Fritchie myth. So he may have received kickbacks for writing all these letters to the editor. He created a lot of government buildings that he designed that stand in Washington, D.C. today. Great property developer, but unfortunately, he lied about his non-service in the Army of Northern Virginia. So you guys know who these two guys are. So you have to remember, on the 4th of September, General Thomas Jonathan Jackson had General A.P. Hill arrested near Leesburg, Virginia, just before they crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. He's blown a head gasket because Hill is not marching his men on the proper 10-minute break of every hour. Hill is still under arrest as the Army encamps at Frederick, Maryland. So what Rosino failed to understand was that Jackson does not want any other of his generals making errors. They have 3 days to plan how are they going to exit Frederick without causing traffic jams. So these are the maps. An 1858 map of Frederick. On the left, this is my own drawing with the colors. This shows Jackson's troops in red that were camped at Worman's Mill and Woods, evacuating Frederick on September 10th, marching south. Now what they did was they turned right onto Church Street, and then they picked up what was called in those days Mill Alley Way, which is now known as Bent Street. And then they filed out past Fritchie's house, which is just about here. The green arrow is A.P. Hill and Longstreet's troops that followed Jackson on the morning of September 10th. This is September 11th. D.H. Hill's troops are camped south and east of Frederick. Over at the Best Farm area, they march north. They turn a left on West Patrick and then exit the city that way. Byerly's photographic studio is here in the middle of the block between Church Street, East Patrick, West Patrick. So when the Confederates leave Frederick, the infantry, none of them pass below Byerly's studio. Now on September 12th, there was only Confederate cavalry and horse artillery in Frederick, but that's not the troops that are in the famous photograph. They exited from multiple directions because they're fleeing from McClellan's army that is right on their heels on the 12th. So this is a detail from the September 27th, 1862 Harper's Weekly engraving. Now what's very interesting is Professor Lowe, who had the balloon corps with the Union Army, he has his balloons on the Maryland campaign. It's very probable that the Harper's Weekly artist hitched a ride in the balloon to make a rough sketch of how Frederick looked from a bird's eye view. These bird's eye views of cities were very popular in the late 1850s in Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. They had bird's eye views of Chicago, of New York City. They would make balloon ascensions. The sketch artist would hitch a ride in the basket. They would make a rough sketch. Then the newspaper office had all kinds of various buildings in block form that they would put together to create the newspaper. So this is how they did it. Now, boxed in red there, this is the Byerly studio. The Rosenstock, or the store where Rosenstock rented during the Civil War, he did not own that store. It was owned by a guy named Schlesinger. Rosenstock, the building that he rented from, was only 2 stories tall during the Civil War, so it cannot be seen in this depiction. Here you can see Jackson's troops taking a right-hand turn on Church Street, exiting the city. Very accurate. The newspaper artist interviewed Frederick citizens at the time because he wanted to get an accurate account of how Jackson's troops left the city. Deadly accurate. We have other evidence from the early 1900s. This shows the Mill Alley Way, which was later Bent Street. Jackson's troops marched and waded across Carroll Creek. They got their feet wet. This is other evidence, a postcard from year 1907 showing the route where Jackson's army crossed. Now, I'm not sure if this footbridge was here during the war or not. It may have been. There's nothing in the records that prove or disprove, but when you have Jackson's full columns of 4 guys across, they probably just marched right through the creek and got their feet wet. Now, this is also on the left, a 1912 year Baltimore Sun, which does show the proper route of Jackson's army exiting Frederick and Fritchie's house here. Jackson bypassed Fritchie's house. One of the other strange things that Rosino fails in his book, There in Maryland, this man, Jacob Engelbrecht, he knew that Jackson had a separate army. He lived in Frederick. He's a citizen of Frederick. He knows all through the spring of 1862 that there's 3 federal armies under McDowell, Banks, Fremont that all exit Frederick to go chase Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. So Jacob Engelbrecht, a men's clothing tailor who later became mayor of Frederick after the war was over in 1865, he wrote a letter to the editor of the Baltimore Sun, which was published on April 24th, 1875, when General Lee got in front of Mrs. Fritchie's house on September 10th, 1862, and in front of mine because he lived right across the street from Fritchie on West Patrick. He and his whole army halted, and I afterwards ascertained that General Stonewall Jackson, who had been encamped north of our city with his army, was coming up Mill Alley or Bent Street. So General Lee waited until General Jackson and his army had passed. All the time that the General Lee stood in front of Mrs. Fritchie's house, I saw no flag waving for Barbara Fritchie. If there had been, I would have seen it. And as for General Jackson and his forces, he did not pass over the bridge on West Patrick Street, but passed up Bent Street west of mine and west of Fritchie's house. So this is my letter to the editor that appeared in the autumn 2020 magazine, MI issue, Military Images. I really dug the article in the last issue about glass lantern slides. The Barbara Fritchie slide is great artwork of an imaginary event that never took place. There were no bullet holes in the roof or windows of Fritchie's house, and if there was a flagpole of any kind on a roof today, it would be housed in the Smithsonian like the severed oak from the Spotsylvania battle. Yet there are no artifacts and nothing of anything like that. None of her neighbors witnessed any such thing as described in Whittier's poem. Stonewall Jackson himself bypassed her house way ahead of his troops at 6 a.m. on September 10, 1862. And his troops also bypassed her house by way of Mill Alley. A.P. Hill's troops marched in front of her house, followed by Longstreet's men later in the morning and all day long. After Whittier's poem came out, it put Frederick on the map for Frederick's first tourism cash cow, even while the war was still in progress. All the people wanted to see where Fritchie lived, so the townspeople, who were mainly Unionists, all played the game to sell lemonade, pies, and cakes to any visitors that came through to see where Fritchie lived. So they all went along with this myth, making the poem seem real when it was not. Anyway, these are the photographers. John Davis Byerly, the son of this man, Jacob Byerly, who was a daguerreotype who opened Maryland's first daguerrean studio in year 1842. He retired after the Civil War, turned the studio over to John Davis Byerly. Now, John Davis, during the war, dated a woman named Mary Markle, who he later married. She had Southern leanings during the war. Dad was firmly a Union man from Pennsylvania. So this is the only known image of any Confederates with a Byerly photographer's stamp on the back. Now, there's no revenue stamp on this CDV. The revenue stamp was a tax that the federal government created in August 1864. The tax lasted 2 years until August 1866 to pay war debt for the North. So we know that this photograph of this unarmed surgeon was most likely taken in late September or early October 1862. He's unarmed. There are no armed Confederate portraits that have a Byerly photographer stamp on the back of the CDV. There are no ambrotypes. There is no other photographed. So what that meant was most likely during the 6-day occupation of the Confederates in 1862, from September 6th through the 12th, the Byerlys, Dad being a Union man, most likely closed the studio because he did not want to accept Confederate money as payment for portraits of armed Confederates in the studio. There would have been a line around the block, like the Good Humor Man, if the studio was opened during the Confederate occupation. Now, because this man is a non-combatant, he's a surgeon, Byerly says, okay, I'll take your photo, but you have to pay in Yankee dollars. So that's the way it worked. It was the same thing with Adams County photographers who photographed Confederate surgeons and medical people in the Tyson Brothers studio in August of 1863. The Northern photographers would take the Southerners' photos only if they were non-combatants, medical guys. So this is the Frederick Examiner news sheet from July 20th, 1864. The edition came out weekly, but they did not produce a July 13th edition because the proprietors had fled to Baltimore during Jubal Early's 1864 Maryland incursion. So over here, there's a column called the Tribute Money, which talks about how the 5 banks in Frederick gathered to pay off the $200,000 ransom that Jubal Early was demanding. A consultation of Union men gathered to consider the exigency. During that time, a regiment of filthy traitors was drawn up in array to enforce the ransom demand, and the reader can well imagine that under such a menace there was no dissenting voice. So it was decided that the banks should bring forth the treasure they had secreted upon the approach of the thieving rebels and pay over the amount, which they did. So right there, that's the key evidence right there for dating the photo to July 9th. Here is a map that my friend Eric Davis and I put together that appears in the latest Battlefield Photographer magazine, which appeared in my house mailbox yesterday. It came in just in time. So this shows the detail of where the 5 banks were and the amount that they paid for the ransom demand payment. Here's where the photo was taken with the arrow direction. The Confederate soldiers are faced south with a rough column of 6 guys across. So from the Frederick Examiner newspaper, it says a regiment of filthy traitors. Now we know when the war began, a regiment contained anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 men. By 1864, a regiment was probably down to about 300 or 400 men. So we can roughly see about 80 to 90 guys in the photo, which is here. So basically there was probably a Confederate brigade lined up on Bankers Row and North Market Street to enforce the demand. Here is the Frederick Examiner newspaper office and print shop, which reported the story. Now, it didn't exactly say in the story where the filthy traitors were lined up, but it makes sense that they would be lined up as enforcers or coercers of the ransom demand payment in front of the 4 out of the 5 banks. So again, here is what we're looking at with the original artwork that appeared in the year 2018, Battlefield Photographer magazine. You can see North Market Street here. This is Patrick Street here. This graphic on the left is from a different compass angle, but you kind of get the picture. So this was a story that I wanted to have published simultaneously in the Military Images magazine with Ron Coddington. Years ago, he said he was all in. He says, yeah, this sounds like a great story. I'm all in. You write it up. I'll publish it. He was going to hopefully publish it simultaneously with the Battlefield Photographer magazine that was just released. Now, what is going on in the photo? This is General Bradley Tyler Johnson at left. He was a prominent Frederick citizen before the war began. His relatives live in these houses here. His grandfather lived in this house, William Bradley Tyler, who was the president of the Central Bank, which was letter C in this graphics. So what is probably going on is on the porch of his uncle are seated 2 armed Confederate soldiers. This is his uncle George Murdoch Tyler's house. So Bradley Tyler Johnson's mother was the older sibling of George Murdoch Tyler, who lived in this house with his 2 Union Army lieutenant sons. So you have families divided during the Civil War. Jubal Early met with Bradley Tyler Johnson on July 8th. Bradley Tyler Johnson is annoyed about the actions of the 8th Illinois Cavalry the day before at the Battle of West Frederick, July 7th. He says, hey, give me the word, I'm going to go smash the 8th Illinois and teach them a lesson. Early says, hold on, don't worry about that. We lost a few guys yesterday, that's small potatoes. He says, I've got a big job for you. I need your cavalry to ride east toward Baltimore. You're going to tear up the B&O railroad tracks, you're going to rip up telegraph lines, then you're going to head south and try to liberate all the prisoners at Point Lookout Camp. Bradley Tyler Johnson says, okay, you're asking mission impossible of tired men and worn out horses. Bradley Tyler Johnson says, okay, I'll do what I can do, but I'm asking you a favor. I've got relatives in Frederick. I know that you've ransomed Hagerstown and you've ransomed Middleton. You're going to ransom my hometown, and if they don't pay the money, you're going to set it on fire. How about I ask you this? If you do have to set the city on fire, can you at least protect my relatives' property? So this is probably what's going on in this photo. Bradley Tyler Johnson was not in Frederick on July 9th. He's riding north of town, heading toward Baltimore. But in all probability, he gives Early a list of properties. He said, these are my family members. Some of them are Northern supporters, but if you could spare their properties, maybe not have them burnt down. So this is George Murdoch Tyler at left. These photos have never been published before. This was in the Tyler family album. This is George Murdoch Tyler at left. The Confederates are seated on his front porch. This is his oldest son, George Late Tyler, lieutenant with a Maryland infantry unit, 6th Maryland. This is his younger son, Lieutenant Ira Tyler. Now, George Late Tyler was wounded on the 5th of May, 1864 at the Battle of the Wilderness. During the photo on July 9th, he's at home in the house where the 2 Confederates are seated on the front porch. He's recovering from a war wound. Ira Tyler was en route to Frederick that day on the railroad train. His brigade commander stopped the railroad train at Iamsville. He disembarked with all those Union troops, missed the Battle of Monocacy. But on that day, July 9th, it must have been a difficult day for George Murdoch Tyler because his father, who had been the president of the Central Bank, died on September 8th, 1863. I haven't found the records. I don't know if George Murdoch Tyler at that point in time assumed the presidency of that bank. It might be likely that he did, so he would have had to open the vault and hand over the money from the Central Bank that day. The other oldest son is there wounded at home inside the house. Ira Tyler, he's away at the war. He does not know his exact whereabouts. This hatchway here is still there today in the modern world on North Market Street. The hatchway you can see visible here. This is the location. Byerly's studio is now in the building to the left. The store where Rosenstock occupied during the Civil War is now occupied by a confectionery known as the Perfect Truffle. This is the Byerly building in a year 1913 to 1915 era photo. This is most likely a George Washington's birthday parade. There's no leaves on the trees in the background. His building was 3 stories tall during the Civil War. This was the building that Rosenstock rented and occupied, but during the Civil War it was only 2 stories high, so the roof line was here. Byerly and company took the photo of the Confederates from a side south-facing window, which was later bricked in only about 4 or 5 years later. So this is just some graphics of my friend Eric Davis and I shimmying that pole up on the side of the building, trying not to be caught as peeping Toms early on a January frosty morning. You can kind of see the measurements. What we did was we did laser markings This is the alleyway to the George Murdoch Tyler house. Over here on this side of the street, we did laser measurements. We marked North Market Street with chalk, kind of measuring it like an NFL football field to get our accurate measurements of exactly where the photo was taken. So this is the new battlefield photographer left, April 2026 date. You can see the Confederate Frederick photo revisited. Again, showing some of the shadows, sunlight shadows that Craig Heberton IV did, where the Confederates on the street don't really cast any shadows. So the photo had to be taken on July 9th. It's my thoughts that the photo was taken late in the afternoon. So Frazanito asked a fundamental question in his 1978 Antietam book. He wants to know who the photographer is, which campaign the scene recorded, and who the troops might be in the photo. So what I do know is that Early had 4 divisions of infantry in his army in July. Breckinridge's division is ordered to stay in Frederick and basically guard the wagon train while the 3 other divisions go fight the Battle of Monocacy. So basically, the troops depicted in the photo are from these Virginia regiments. Now, Breckinridge also had a brigade of mounted infantry, which consisted of Virginia and Tennessee troops. I don't believe the guys in the photo are mounted infantry, so there you have it. Those are the guys depicted most likely in the image. So this is a little bit of an encore. This is my next story I'm working on. This was from the Frederick Examiner news sheet, October 8th, 1862. This story is about Lincoln's visit to Frederick after he visits the Antietam battlefield and has consultations with General McClellan. Now what he does is he wants to visit the wounded Union General Hartsuff, who was wounded fighting with Hooker's First Corps early on the morning of September 17th. He is being nursed by Dr. William Tyler, which is a distant cousin of Dr. William Bradley Tyler. Both are presidents of 2 of the 5 banks in Frederick during the Civil War. His daughter, Eleanor Tyler Ramsey, married a guy named Ramsey, and they lived in Washington, D.C. He had died in 1858, so upon his death, she moves back to Frederick. This was a photo that was in the dockets of Heritage Frederick, used to be called Frederick Historical Society. I went and contacted the owners that donated the image. I noticed a cameo around this woman's neck. The woman and her husband who donated the photos identified this through the family cameo, which still exists. This is Eleanor Ramsey that nursed General Hartsuff. Lincoln paid a short visit to their house. So this is going to be my next story in battlefield photographer. This photo was once published in the Washington Post, but they didn't identify any names. This is Nanny Tyler Page, the younger sister of Eleanor Ramsey. They lived 4 or 5 houses distance from each other when they were senior citizens. Eleanor passed away first. Anyway, thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Oh, yeah.
And thanks again for having me. My good friend Steve Fernandez here, he showed me a little while back some nice photos when he was younger as a Civil War recreator, so I thought I would show you guys a few photos from my time being a recreator. This is when I was younger here at Left. The Sailor's Creek reenactment, 1984. I had read that some Confederates wore carpets as winter coats. So this is at the big 125th Gettysburg, which was the largest mock battle in the world that ever took place. I guess there was about 13,000 of us. This was when I went down to Brazil. You guys being sons of Confederate veterans, you know that there's camps down in Brazil. Every year they have Festa Confederata, a big to-do down there. So, and thanks again for having me.